Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm trying to figure out if I want to read my notes from my phone or my notebook. But we're here today to talk about the emerging energy around RBM RCS and the importance of identity verification given the additional risk that comes to both the consumers and the mobile operators with the RCS product. So that said, Glyn, do you want to introduce yourself again real quick before we go?
Sure. So Glyn Povah, Telefonica. Been doing network APIs for quite a while now, last 7 or 8 years, particularly focused on the identity space. And obviously we're big supporters of Open Gateway and Kamara, as was mentioned in the last session.
And Claudine?
I'm Claudine Bell. I work for Virgin Media O2 in the messaging and payments area, working with wholesale SMS and RBM.
And then, as I said, I'm John Bruner, and just briefly, Aegis is a compliance company that's been around for about 18 years, working in telecom and offer dozens of products that support compliance activities to the telecom industry. But today we're going to be talking about identity. So I guess, Glyn, kind of pivoting off of your prior panel, you want to kick us off here?
Sure. I mean, I think, maybe RCS or RBM has been a long time in the making, and maybe it's, approaching its kind of its pivotal moment in its history. But I think one of the exciting things from my perspective, and we'll talk a little bit more about this on the panel hopefully, is we're finally getting to a point where actually identity is coming into, in its front and center of actually a product that we're launching as a telco operator into the market. And actually we talked about in the last panel about building new capabilities. We talked about Open Gateway and about using APIs to expose those capabilities into the market and let brands basically innovate on top of that and build that into their own capabilities and user journeys. But I think with with RCS, or particularly RBM, which is the business messaging side of RCS, the ability to do this verified sender, is kind of game changing. Not just for messaging, but it's something potentially we can reuse for a bunch of other telco capabilities. So once we have that new capability in our networks, and John's company has been working on this for many years. I'm sure you can tell us about how that works, experience of other markets. But I do think it's very exciting, and I think the thing will be, how do we scale that up? Maybe Claudine, you've got some ideas on that. But I think programmatic and APIs is going to be one way we can achieve that. AI, I think, will probably help us. We obviously need to make sure that when we create this new platform, this new ability to verify that brands are who they say they are, going back to the authentication theme, that actually the fraudsters don't then jump on top of that and try and abuse that platform for their own malicious means. And also that there's the inclusivity. I talked about it on my last panel, but we need to make sure we don't leave people behind. So if all of us are engaged in this massive new community of receiving verified business messages, or RBM, there might still be people that only have feature phones that can only receive SMS. We need to make sure that they don't suffer more fraud as a result of us rolling out new, better technologies with identity built in the heart of it and authentication built in the heart of it.
No consumer left behind. I like that. Claudine, so as Glyn mentioned, you've been involved in the launch of RBM. What would you like to add in terms of your challenges and the successes you've had?
So I think I sit on the Cross Network Operator Forum for RCS in the UK, working with the other UK operators and with Google as well. I think we've learned some lessons in RCS. I could see a couple of you in the audience laughing at that one, and it's true, we have learned some lessons. I think we're at a point now, certainly in the UK, where we've got commercial services launched. We've run through what was admittedly a slightly arduous sign-up process for the verification piece. And we've got it to a point where it's running fairly smoothly. The market for RBM in the UK, whilst live and commercial, isn't massive yet. It's getting there. It is growing. It's certainly grown more in the last year than it grew in the previous 5. But we are addressing as a unit, as a collaborative unit, in the messaging ecosystem, how we are going to address the verification process when it does take off. There's been talk of it not just being an Android technology, not to labour that point too much in this forum, but when the reach is extended, more brands are going to come on board and they are going to need verifying. So we're working as a collective group at Cross Network Operator to understand how we do that in the right way. Not just that it's simple for brands and we're not putting up any further pain points or creating further friction, but that it really retains that ability to say this service has been approved and verified by O2 or Vodafone or whichever network you're on. That is one of the key things that we see as a benefit of RBM. And as you touched on earlier, and I think also Victoria talked about it in her previous panel, collaboration is really important. I've worked in the mobile industry for more decades than I care to mention. And I think a lot of the time, particularly as carriers, we're quite, we're quite closed off and we're very super careful about not collaborating or being seen to do anything, that we shouldn't be doing or talk about things that we shouldn't be talking about. I think we need to talk more. I think we need to talk more as an industry about how we can protect consumers. I think we need to be more giving, within a trusted environment of where we're seeing positive things happening, but also where we're seeing those negative things happening. There's no point pretending that fraud doesn't happen on messaging. It absolutely does. I think the verification on RBM will solve a lot of those problems. I think it will also enable us to look at it and say, this verification for RBM could potentially almost backfill to SMS in certain verticals where we know there to be more risk. For SMS and also for calls as well. So,
absolutely. So those of you that I guess I haven't spoken in front of before, just as a quick background. So in the US market, we launched a centralized registry for what's called 10DLC A2P messaging, and it kind of took off with the concept of every entity that wants to send messages to their customers must be registered, identity verified, and if you want to do high volume messaging, you get a background check. And so what we were involved in was putting up an automated API-based identity verification platform for businesses that does all this in seconds per company and processes roughly 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 companies every day coming in new, and has done as many as 46,000 in a single day. That's companies registering to do A2P messaging. And what this does is it creates a known sender, and when you see bad behavior in the market, you have traced back to the sender. There's a lot more complexity to it than that. What we're learning in that industry, to reemphasize your point though, is that there are a lot of players. We have 1,300 CPaaS and sub-aggregators operating in that market. They're all, submitting their brands. But in terms of stopping fraud, under contract or based on competition, type of issues, the sharing of information on bad actors has been very complex, if you will. But anyway, but that said, so we're kind of jumping into RCS here. And so, Claudine, I'll start with you. So what is it about RCS RBM, business messaging, that kind of creates more risk that we really need to go for a deeper vetting and verification of both the brand and its assets that it wants to put out there?
I think if we're being really honest about it, the fact that it says this service is verified by O2 UK, we're taking a lot of responsibility for that verification in a way that we don't have to at the moment for SMS. And certainly it's something that's really important to me in our area of the business, that if we are telling our consumers that we have checked this service, it's been checked and we've got absolute confidence in that. I don't think anything is 100%. I'm certainly not sitting on a stage being recorded saying it's never going to go wrong.
We're only as good as the data we can get to, right?
Yeah. But I think that, if it says it's verified by O2 UK, then we need to make sure that we're doing that. And we are doing that right now. Once it reaches volume, it is going to become more challenging, as you say. And it's really quite easy to verify if you've got a Barclays Bank. It's not quite so easy to verify if you've got an SMB. Or you've got like Joe's Pizza Parlour that wants to avail themselves of RBM and do that, with their logo and what have you. That's actually a little bit more difficult than Barclays Bank because of all the checks we have in place. So we've got some challenges ahead.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Glyn, what do you want to add to that?
I mean, I think I talked about it earlier. It's exciting to have this new verified sender capability, and it addresses the KYB side, which we haven't, really done before as telcos. I think we can reuse that, as Claudine mentioned, not just for, let's get going with RBM, certainly. but we can reuse it, potentially backfill it into SMS. Certainly for voice, there's a massive opportunity to do verified voice as well. And actually it plays really to what I talked about in the previous panel about voice social engineering, vishing, and all the APP fraud we have in the UK and other markets. And that is the ability of fraudsters to effectively, mostly via international routes, terminate voice calls on our subscribers, whether that's O2 in the UK or in other Telefonica markets, and do impersonation fraud. And part of the impersonation fraud and the mechanics of it is that they are in some way able to terminate with a number that is part of that brand or looks like that brand. And so actually being able to move that into the voice channel, I think is going to be really exciting. I think further down the line, not to get carried away with ourselves, because we are telcos after all, so even if we execute a lot faster, I think the KYC side is the other piece of that puzzle, right? So if we can get going with the RBM and the verified sender, then I think I'm really interested in thinking about the KYC side, because that plays to a lot of the stuff that we talked about this morning, which is the reusable digital identities, the verifiable credentials. You can't do any of that stuff without knowing or having a high degree of confidence that your customer is who they say they are.
Exactly.
We're a long way from that in markets like the UK, where you can walk into a newsagent and buy 20 SIM cards without showing any single piece of paper or anything. And the UK is a strange market in an identity sense, because of various historical reasons, I guess, and our press and media aren't big fans of digital ID, I think, or even just any ID.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that it opens up a really exciting new journey for us as telcos and this community, the CPaaS players, beyond just business messaging for RCS.
I agree 100%. So, we were talking about risk as well, right? So why is RBM so much more risk than flat messaging? And we've got two initiatives going on in the U.S. market. One is the RBM is starting to launch. One of the carriers we've been working with for 2 years, they're doing RBM, vetting and onboarding and all that. Others are just launching the standard with just the logo-based messaging. But, the fear there for that is that a consumer is going to be more likely to engage if they see the logo. So the protection of that consumer becomes more important than just getting a message from who they think is a company versus getting a branded message. Not to mention the fact that the carriers are going to be putting that, the mobile operator is going to say that they've verified this sender. But the concept here is with branded messaging and chatbots is that there's much more trust that's going to come from a consumer. So who are the legal matters going to come back to? Who are the regulators going to come back to? It's going to be the carriers, quite honestly, because that's what they seem to do globally. So, protecting their customers, protecting their brand, with this wonderful channel becomes much, much more important. The second thing that's being launched in the U.S. market is called brand calling, or BCID, brand calling ID. And that's a national launch that's being put out. But what they've done is, in the U.S. market is created extensive requirements on the background checks of the brands, and they are who they say they are, but also on the logo itself. What are the rights to use it? Does it exist? Are there infringements? So RBM opens up a lot of complexity too in terms of, can we verify that that logo belongs to that company and that they have the rights to use it? And that's great when, as you said, you're working with Barclays Bank or some large brand that everybody knows. It's easy, but the reality is what we see in messaging at volume, where we've processed 2.7 million businesses in the last 2 years, is that 80-90% of those businesses are not Fortune 500 or very large companies. They are medium, small, and maybe slightly large companies, and they have unregistered logos. So to get revenue generation, we have to go broadly to the market, which means we're going to be taking, at some point, unregistered logos. It's doable, but it introduces other risks, to RBM. You guys have anything on that you want to add?
I was feeling quite positive, and now I'm all a bit worried about it.
Yeah, we can do it.
No, I think the reality is, for me, certainly coming from a long-standing messaging background, is it feels and it seems, and we've had a lot of conversations about this. The time is right. We do have, as a carrier, we have RBM, which is it's affording us that opportunity to authenticate and verify the brand. We have a set of APIs to authenticate the consumer, And we need to be smart and agile about how we fit that together to deliver a sort of that end-to-end solution across our across messaging, be that SMS, RCS, RBM, and voice. And this is the time to do that, because the story you told earlier, which obviously you shared with me before, was about the bank wanting to move to all of their comms through an app. Well, what about those people that don't understand apps, or don't want an app, or don't have that sort of device? There are enormous amounts of people who are vulnerable in lots of ways in this country and globally, whether that's an age matter, whether that's an educational matter, whether they're financially vulnerable, whether they are potentially, suffering from dementia. And these are challenging things to ask people. Download an app, call me through an app is enormously daunting. Enabling a similar feature set on a smartphone if they have it, or falling back to SMS, but with the same checks and balances in place, which we've been able to implement because we started with a verification of an RBM service, seems like a way to support those people a little bit better than perhaps as an ecosystem we're doing it right now.
Yeah, and just to answer your question directly, John, I guess...
Which I didn't.
I guess, a lot of the brands we're dealing with as telcos, either directly or through partners, are big global brands, right, by definition. So, or big global or local banks, and that is where a lot of the fraud is. So, all the UK banks or, companies like Airbnb who are doing hospitality on a global basis. If I'm a fraudster and I can convince a consumer by impersonation that I am that brand, then, potentially that is where a lot of the fraud is happening. That's where 80-90% of the fraud is happening, right? So, if already we just go after the top, 1,000, 10,000 brands, including, the big UK ones, for example, in the UK, we're going to really make a big impact on that fraud.
Yeah.
And then we're going to learn a lot about, how it works, maybe some of the edge cases, some of the places it doesn't work so well, and we can apply that then to moving down the stack to the SMEs and the one-man bands, and figure out. I think we'll have to figure it out as we go along. I think there's no easy answer on that, right?
Well, and I think it's wonderful that you're actually talking about stopping the fraud as opposed to growing the business from a revenue perspective. So you just basically said we can stop the fraud with this too, which is a great position.
Well, I think, we have to be part of the solution as well.
Absolutely. No, I think that's wonderful, quite honestly. So we talked a little bit the other day as well, though, that, RBM opens up a lot of different kinds of use cases that can bring exposure to consumers depending on how RBM is implemented for each campaign type, and what's the impact on identity, based on that. Shall we discuss that a little bit?
Sure.
You want me to start?
Absolutely. Please kick us off, John.
Yeah. So it's very interesting because some of the at-scale conversations that we've been having with carriers in different countries is, depending on the use case type, what kind of information is the consumer going to be engaging in, and what industry is the brand in that's registering, or how big is the brand that's registering, and how much do we know about them, all can drive the periodic rate by which we recheck them in terms of their integrity, their behavior, in the world, right? So, are they all of a sudden being sued for consumer fraud by a regulator? And if it's a low risk, chatbot engagement, if you will, from a consumer exposure perspective, you don't need to necessarily be monitoring that company as frequency. But if it's a high risk chatbot engagement, and you've got companies, and certainly like in the U.S. industry, cross-state advertising of or sales of marijuana, cannabis is illegal. Well, that doesn't mean that you say no to companies that are in that industry, because it is legal in states. But at the same time, carriers have to be careful because federally, nationally, it's illegal. So, what are the things that are in place to protect both the carriers and their consumers based on the types of companies that are running on these networks, but also based on what is the use case from a campaign perspective that they're going to be running. And so from that perspective, from an identity perspective and a behavioral background check perspective, and maybe even if a major brand is being sued for trademark infringements on their logo, a monitoring of an ongoing basis becomes very, very important, but you also have to have the ability to configure, because you're going to have different requirements on different purposes, if you will.
I mean, I think we've got to, navigate that identity verification piece quite carefully. I guess we're going to count on companies like yours, John, with the experience you have in the US and other markets, that we can do it to a high level of assurance, right, and continuously verify that the company is who they said they were when we did it the first time round. And if we can do that in a really robust way, starting with some big global brands, where the risk is reduced, I guess, from the carrier perspective, then that's a great place to start.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, I think that one of the things that we do need to look at is that ongoing verification. It's great to do it right at the beginning. You've got a service set up, and companies like yours have done the relevant checks, but there needs to be a degree of regularity to that. It can't just say, right, it's been running for 2 years and it was checked at the beginning, therefore it is still fine. I think that's going to be a real key thing as we see growth.
Yeah, I'll be honest. So we've been in the open gateway type business space for 7 or 8 years now, doing vetting and onboarding of brands that want to use the identity APIs for carriers in the US. And what's interesting there too is that depending on the use case, what kind of identity information are they getting determines how frequently we're looking at those brands on an ongoing basis, and what are we looking for in their past, right? Which includes continuous scanning of the market for security breaches of those companies that are using those APIs. So anyways, it's definitely a capability that's coming over to RCS, for us being a more recent product than the APIs. So Glyn was talking a little bit earlier about the concept of, we're talking about the business verification so that the consumer can trust the engagement of RBM. But Glyn was saying, well, with identity APIs, we could actually create a two-way verification that the business that's engaging the customer can actually feel comfortable that that is the customer that they think it is, right? And what does that do for RBM and RCS as types of use cases and things that could come in the future if we can create that two-way authentication of identity?
I think one easy example would be, maybe we can use RBM, and cleverly, join it up with voice so that we can either terminate voice calls in an RCS message in a branded way or a secure verified way, but even allow consumers to use it towards brands, right? To verify themselves if we can get the KYC part right. So I think there are some really exciting opportunities for carriers there. But I do think, just generally speaking, where we want to get to is where we started as telcos 20 years ago, which is, in the UK there were 4 networks. They all trusted each other. There was no global interconnect. There wasn't hundreds and hundreds of interconnects, which the regulators made us have, by the way. And if I saw a CLI from, my friend or even the local pizza shop, I could really be 100% confident that they were who they say they were. I think we want to go back to that place, but with new technology and new ways of doing that, because obviously we're in a much more complex world now of global interconnect and all that spaghetti, and that's not going to go away. That's why I talked about out of band earlier on as being one solution to that. There are other mechanisms, but it would be great, I think, to get back to that. My first GSM 2110, when I saw my first CLI come up, and I knew it was my mum probably. That she was the person who she said she was, and that it wasn't transiting hundreds of global networks, and we had that kind of level of confidence back in our phone networks that we could trust that the person calling was who they say they were, and that works from a brand side and a consumer side, I think.
Thank you. What he said?
What he said, yeah. We do. We need the trust both ways, and we need the verification both ways. I know I sort of said it before, and it was slightly off topic from your question, but I believe this is that opportunity to deliver it, and I do think it also will represent commercially a cost savings businesses. Missed calls should be reduced if people understand that really is a verified, call from your bank, your doctor's surgery. the job centre, those sensitive areas of business where, there is a little bit of reluctance. So that's certainly sort of, I think, what we're hoping to work towards.
I think healthcare as well. There's tons of healthcare use cases where people don't answer the phone because they think it's a scam call, but actually it's an urgent appointment they need to attend, or people want to give sensitive information over the call. So you really want to be sure it's your doctor you're talking to, and that they want to be sure they're talking to you, right? Because I think sometimes the doctors won't even leave voicemail messages because they're not allowed to by protocol, because they can't guarantee that they've effectively identity proved you or authenticated you.
Yeah, absolutely. And even, something as simple as going to an appointment where you need to provide some documentation. Say, let's use the example of a job centre for Universal Credit. If someone's never been through that experience before, they may get a call to say, don't forget to bring your passport or your, whatever piece of ID that may be, or to change the appointment. And they don't answer the phone because they don't recognise the number. The person at the job centre doesn't leave a message because it's just a generic thanks for phoning O2's voicemail message. So they don't leave a message because that's a bit sensitive. Sometimes, people going to the job centre. Person will turn up at the appointment with not enough information. So there's a delay for them. There's a delay to the consumer receiving a benefit that they might desperately need. There's a cost to the government, to the council, to the job centre of having to start that process or delay that process and bring the documentation. And it also creates a massive environment of stress for people. So I think it's not just, I don't want to say just and underplay it, but it's not simply a case of looking at financial impact fraud, but how we can better support
trust,
the identity piece and build that trust. And there are savings, to be had, whether that's savings for the NHS or savings for the government or savings for a commercial enterprise.
So one of the final things I wanted to just mention was in terms of RBM and identity, there's a tremendous opportunity here as well, because we're talking about verification of identity and behavioral history of a company, but then we're talking about adding assets that are verified to that company, like their logos. And the fact is that that's going to be dynamic in terms of campaigns that are launched, right? So in one case, you want those verifications of identity and behavior to be dynamic. You also want feedback from the market. Are they performing well? Are they not doing fraud? Or if they are doing fraud, how does that intelligence get back to the verification authority, right? Because it's very important to stop them from coming back after you shut them down. Because if you can, when they come in to be revetted, you can stop them. But the other thing that becomes very relevant is we're talking about a lot of different channels. So how do we create a single experience for the brand? If they're going for identity APIs and they have to get verified who they are and vetted behaviorally to get access to the APIs, that's one thing. But then they have to go over here for RCS or over here for messaging or over here for branded calling. So how do we create a more dynamic, centralized brand, right, identity that we can dynamically manage, but also put their assets into that, if you will, virtual wallet? My friend Randy's here. That is live and therefore protect consumers, but also give the companies the ability to do what they want to do in terms of reaching out to their consumers and engaging them. So, do you guys want to add anything?
Just to finish up, John, just to say, I think, we talked about a lot in this panel, but for me, it's all about bringing utility and trust back to comms. And that's really our mission, I think, in the next years.
Yeah, and the collaboration by the operators, by the technology partners. That's going to be a clear. Even with me at Virgin Media O2 and Glyn and Telefonica, we need to be talking and we need to be sharing information in a more effective way.
And I agree.
One question.
Hi, thank you. My name is Mary Camacho. You guys talked a lot about the types of fraud that is being perpetuated, and I'm really curious because I find this very hard to really find good data about. But do you have a sense of like the age groups that are the victims of the most fraud, regardless of the type? Because I understand there's so many different kinds that is happening.
I can give a comment on that for APP fraud or voice social engineering, phishing fraud. I think when we talk to customers about it, the answer is actually quite surprising, because many people assume, well, it's a certain generation that's subject to these frauds. Certainly in value terms, that may be true, just because they have more assets, right? But actually, when we talked about other demographics, like maybe the younger generations, they were kind of like, well, actually the volumes are very high there, and the reason is that they just assume someone's going to either they're busy or they don't care, or the values are low, or quite often they assume someone's always going to refund them. So they're kind of like, yeah, I got, someone stole, £1,000 from my bank account, but don't worry, that bank's going to refund me 24 hours later, so I don't care. So I think, yeah, the volume and value equations are quite different, and the reactions between different generations could be different, but I think it affects all generations.
My name's Johnny Santonaciuto. I'm calling from JT Global. I'm one of the people responsible for selling these APIs and these new technologies into banks and financial institutions. The feedback that I'm getting from those areas is that they really want some significant SLAs, almost in line with payment SLAs. Payment SLAs only want minimum outages, maybe 12 a year with a month's notice, fallback, disaster recovery, and as yet we haven't got any of that. So it's really good having all these APIs, but without having the background resilience, I don't think we're going to get very far.
The short answer to that is I'm a massive fan of having high performance APIs where they're required for our customers, and certainly the banking sectors and the sort of Visas and Mastercards of the world they're talking about sub 100 TPS, right? At 99.9. That's typical carrier territory, by the way. We do much better than that in the carrier world. We're going to have to try and do that for our customers in the API world, but not for all of them, and not for all use cases, but some of the ones you mentioned.
It's more for verification for payment and app access.
Certainly in the payment space, if we want to play in that space, we're going to have to do high performance services, yeah.
The last question's over here.
Hi, Hélène Viguier from GSMA. I'm very interested in your topic of identity vetting for the enterprises. I was wondering if you could share some feedback from your experience in the US on how onerous this is for the brands, and how, when we talk of RBM, this vetting, I don't know how much of it is seamless for the brands, the monitoring you might be doing, versus how much of it is they have to provide documentation, and how that might slow down the adoption when we try and translate that to the RBM space.
So what we are trying to do is create very high volume, low cost, low friction capabilities, because we don't want brands to jump to other channels, quite honestly, right? So today we take companies for the US market from about 155 countries that want to do A2P in the United States market. From an identity perspective, we can verify we've got a real company in about 3 to 5 seconds from all those countries. And what they're giving us is a valid government ID, a legal name, an email address, a website URL, a location of registration of the company. And we have automated means to do direct contact to verify they are who they say they are. It's only as good as the data we get and the data that we can find, but we can do things like look at the URL and the email and see if we can tie it to that company. We can look at phone number risk, or we can integrate with physical mail, or we can do phone calls, but all of that's based on data that we can find. But again, the idea is, how much identity verification is needed, and to do the amount that's required to protect both the mobile operators and the consumers, but not to do more and not to do less. In terms of behavioral history, we have varying risk scores that get applied to companies, where we're looking at anything that's legal action, regulatory action, criminal actions, international sanctions, watch lists, money laundering, country risk. All of that goes on at about 15 to 20 seconds on a company. And based on the mobile operators that we're supporting, they've given us how they want us to score those results in terms of behavioral history. One of the interesting things is, for a very new company that might be less than a year old, 2 employees, 100,000 in revenue, there is no history. So what winds up happening is they get a very low score out of the gate, and then their number of messages per second on some of the networks is actually controlled until they can prove themselves. So the idea there too is to go to a dynamic scoring. We get the complaint data from Apple, for example. We can tie that back to the phone number, which we tie back to the brand. right? And over time, we can make sure the performance is there, that they're not hurting people. So it's there's a lot there that's going on, but to your point, our objective is low cost, low friction, high volume, capabilities that do as much as is needed, no more, no less, so that we can keep people coming into this channel and do it with trust.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, John, for presenting, and thanks to the panel.
Thank you guys very much.